Hey everyone, I'm Michael. Welcome to my channel, Michael's Mormon Deconstruction. Today I wanted to talk to you about my decision to read through the entire Bible and some of my problems I have with how I was taught to engage with the Bible and what I've learned about how to engage with it as someone outside of faith. Now, I want to mention that most people would consider me to be an agnostic atheist. And what that means is I don't believe in any sort of single God, but I don't claim that it's possible to know whether or not there is a God or not. So I am not making the claim that there is no God. I'm just making the claim that I do not believe in one, and I have yet to see any reason to believe in one. And I think that's important context because most people that are reading the Bible tend not to be atheists or agnostics. They tend to already be motivated to believe in the Bible. Now, why am I reading the Bible if I'm not a Christian and I'm not coming at it from a place of worship? Well, the main reason is because of my upbringing, right? I was raised in the Mormon church, which means I formed a very particular relationship with the book. And as I left the church, my view of the Bible was tarnished pretty irreparably. So, my goal with rereading the Bible today is to engage with it in a more open minded and curious point of view, as opposed to a this is the word of God and I need to make sure I'm following every word of it point of view. And I want to emphasize that I'm trying to be both open and critical. There's probably some very interesting things to learn here. There's some things that are going to be super, super cool. And there's probably going to be some things that probably didn't age very well, to say the least. I'm not going into this trying to make a mockery of the Bible. I want to do the exact opposite. I want to encourage more people to respect it as a work of literature as well as a work of, worship, while also convincing people that treat it as infallible to maybe look at it from a different point of view. I also want to acknowledge that this is an extremely complex topic, one that I don't claim to be an expert on, and I hope that because of that you won't write me off entirely, even though I'm not an authority on the topic. The first decision I had to make when I decided I wanted to read through the whole Bible was which translation do I want to use? And why are there so many translations of the Bible? Well, it's because the books were written thousands of years ago in non English languages. To be specific, the Old Testament was written in Hebrew, and the New Testament was written in Greek. In order for an English speaker like myself to engage with the book, I have to rely on a translator's point of view. Now, of course, there are some very famous translations of the Bible. The most notable of them all is the King James Version. The King James Version is very famous for a lot of reasons. The biggest one being it was commissioned by the King of England back a few hundred years ago to be the authoritative translation into English. And this translation is known for being extremely influential for that reason. It's also known for being extremely beautiful to read. The language is very eloquent, but there's a couple problems with it. The first being that it's based on some very, very outdated manuscripts as of today. We've just uncovered a lot more archaeological discoveries that illuminate more on what the original source texts actually said, and it's littered with very archaic language. If you've ever heard a Bible verse that says, thou shalt not in the commandments, for example, or thou art, or wherefore art thou, that kind of language that sounds Shakespearean in a sense. The King James Version used that language, and that's why that kind of language is almost synonymous with the Bible itself. Another very popular translation, especially in America, is the New International Version, which is very popular among evangelicals, and it's known for its ease of reading. The translation is very modern, the English in it is very modern, and it breaks it up into paragraphs as opposed to individual verses, making it read more like an actual modern book. However, this translation does smooth over some theological tensions within the book in order to make it all square away cleanly. And the third very popular translation that many use is the English Standard Version, or the ESV. Now, this one is especially popular among conservatives because the translator's goal was intentionally to make things more theologically consistent, not to make an accurate translation based upon the source text. I wanted to avoid it because I was looking for something that wasn't theologically motivated, but was instead academically motivated. So, through my research, I ended up picking up a copy of the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible, specifically the updated edition. Here's my copy right here. But I chose it because it's accepted by most scholars to be extremely accurate to the source texts. It includes new source texts or new versions of source text that are older and probably more accurate, such as the Dead Sea Scrolls that earlier translations didn't have access to. And it also maintains those perks of being very readable and very modern English as well. It's important to note that the translation that you choose to read, if you ever choose to read the Bible, does impact your experience because the translators do have motivations in their translations. Like I've already discussed with the most popular ones, there were motivations that do not emphasize accuracy, but instead emphasize worship and theological revisionism. And there's no shame in that. If that's the version you prefer to read and you get more out of it, I don't blame you at all. But for the purposes of what I was doing when I was reading the Bible, I wanted one that was closest to the source text. And I'll explain more about why I wanted it to be as accurate as possible. And I didn't want editing to be across books and make the other books not contradict with each other in just a second. One of the most important things to understand about the Bible is that it's not a single book. It's a collection of books. Think of it more like a library. It's a collection of books that evolved over time. Some books were added, some books were removed, and the books were all written by different authors. There was not a single author or a single editor that went through and wrote the whole thing. Now, of course, I don't mean that to be disrespectful to people who believe that God had his hand in all of the writing. What I'm saying doesn't contradict with that at all. I'm saying that even if that were true, we have to keep in mind that each individual book within the Bible is not authored by God. It's authored by the person who wrote down the text onto the piece of paper or onto the papyrus or onto the plates or onto whatever. When the author of Genesis was writing Genesis, they were not saying, "Oh, I'm so excited to be writing the first book in the Bible." They were just writing Genesis. And that's true of every single book in this collection. Not a single person that was writing a book in this collection knew that they were one day going to be a part of something called the Bible. Now, I think the most obvious example of how the Bible is a collection of books that have different goals is Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, presenting two different ideas of what the world is and the philosophy surrounding that. Proverbs leans heavily on this idea that there's a cause and effect relationship of the moral order. And if you do something bad will happen, right? Or if you do something good, good things will happen. That's kind of the Proverbs message. And then we get to Ecclesiastes, and it gives the exact opposite approach, where it has more of this existential skepticism of like, what does it matter attitude to it. It's not because there's a contradiction in the Bible. There were two different authors, one who wrote Proverbs and one who wrote Ecclesiastes, and they both had different ideas of what the world is. And I think that's important to understand when you're reading this book. It's not just inconsistencies. It reveals that there's multiple authors, and these different authors had different theological, political, and philosophical goals. So it's important to remember when you're going into the next book in your Bible reading journey that it's a new book. It's not a continuation of the last book in most cases. There are some cases where it makes sense to read it that way, such as if you're reading Ezra and then Nehemiah, they tend to go together. Or if you're reading the Pentateuch, which includes Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, and Numbers, because those were all written as a group. But for the most part, when you go to a new book, it's a new author, and you should be treating it as such. We've talked a little bit now about the canon of the Bible and how it's a collection of books and not a book. The obvious follow up question is, how was it decided which books would be included as part of the Bible? And that's where we get into an interesting discussion of both canonization as well as apocryphal works. An apocryphal book is one that was written around the same time period and covered topics relevant to what we would now include in the Bible. However, they were not included in the canon, and that's it. It's a book that was at some point considered to be biblical or otherwise theologically important and now no longer is and is instead considered apocryphal. And apocryphal works, as you can imagine, are a result of the canonization process of the Bible. Different sects of Christianity and Judaism differ on what they agree are canonical works of the Bible. So some sects may consider something to be apocryphal that other sects accept as part of the Bible. The most obvious example of this is 1st and 2nd Maccabees. These two books are considered by Catholics and Orthodox members to be canonical works in the Bible. However, Protestants have since dropped that book from their canon, and they consider it apocryphal work. And understanding which books were apocryphal and why they were not included helps you understand a little better about a sect's beliefs, because understanding why they didn't include a book reveals more about their theology as well as their political and philosophical goals. There's two very neat examples of New Testament apocrypha that I wanted to discuss really quickly. The first being the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch is referenced in the canonical New Testament in the Book of Jude. However, it's excluded. The only way you can read the Book of Enoch is to buy a collection of apocryphal New Testament works, such as this copy of the Apocryphal Gospels I bought, which I'll talk more about in a little bit. It was likely not included in the New Testament canon because it focuses on fallen angels and heavenly secrets. And these things are today typically seen as sacrilegious or heretical. Now, another apocryphal work in the New Testament that is extremely infamous is the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is a sayings book, meaning it's just a collection of quotes attributed to Jesus. It also has no narrative. It does not focus on any stories about Jesus or his life. It's only his sayings. Many consider it to be a Gnostic gospel. Gnosticism was a sect of Christianity that believed that Jesus had a secret ministry where he would give secret teachings, and in order to, go to heaven, you had to be aware of these teachings. You had to have the knowledge. That's where the word Gnostic comes from. Of course, when the New Testament was being compiled, the book was likely excluded because of its Gnostic undertones. An example that I personally had in my study thus far are the books of 1st and 2nd Esdras. Now, there are two books present in the Old Testament today, in all copies of the Old Testament, called Ezra and Nehemiah, previously known as just Ezra and Nehemiah, a single book. It's a simple book. It tells the story that most of the Bible's telling about how the Jews are persecuted and how they want to rebuild Jerusalem. But there are two apocryphal works called 1st and 2nd Esdras, which tell the same story. They are also the story of Ezra and rebuilding Jerusalem. Now, you might be wondering then, what are the differences, right? The differences are that Ezra and Nehemiah was written in Hebrew, whereas 1st and 2nd Esdras were written in Greek. Both are written around the same time period, but they also differ in narrative. It even goes as far as in 1st and 2nd Esdras, there is no Nehemiah character at all. Anything that was attributed to Nehemiah in the Ezra Nehemiah collection is attributed just to Ezra, which brings into question whether a historical Nehemiah even existed in the first place if the Greek copies did not include him. These kinds of differences give a very interesting illumination onto why things were canonized and why things weren't. Perhaps the people compiling the Old Testament did not feel comfortable with the contradiction between whether or not Nehemiah even existed. What's even more interesting is most early Christians accepted 1st and 2nd Esdras as canon. Many very famous early Christians, such as these two here, were known for quoting some of the stories in 1st Esdras. Over time, 1st and 2nd Esdras have become apocryphal works. Are there any other books in the Old Testament which may become apocryphal in the next 100 or 200 years? It's possible. It's happened before. All of that to say, the canonization process is inherently political. It is used in order to say, our Bible says these things. And because we're claiming this to be our source of truth, we want to make sure that our source of truth has what we believe to be true in it and not things that we don't believe to be true. And by looking at apocryphal work while reading the Bible, it helps you better understand what the Bible's goal was, or the compilation that became the Bible, what its goal was, while keeping in mind that its goal is separate from the individual books' goals, because those books didn't know they would be included in this collection. With all of that being said, what's been the difference for me thus far reading the Bible from this new lens as opposed to the lens that was given to me when I was reading it when I was in church? I think the key thing was when you were in church, critical thought is discouraged. Asking a hard question in Sunday school or pointing out an inconsistency in the teacher's or in the book's narrative was met with disdain. Not only was it met with disdain, it was typically considered disruptive, and you would typically get in trouble for doing so. And that leads me to discussing the difference between studying and being indoctrinated. The church's goal is typically not to encourage thoughtful discussion and study. The church's goal is to indoctrinate. And I understand that indoctrinate has a very negative connotation. It's associated with brainwashing, and that's not what I mean. I want to be very clear that when I say indoctrinate, I mean believe the doctrine that we have established. And that's all fine and good. I think that's a valid thing for a church to do. I think their whole goal should be to have you agree with their already accepted canon, right? And to do that, churches give pre-packaged interpretations of how you should already be interpreting the books you're reading. However, that doesn't jive with me personally because I've always been a very, very curious person who wants to learn more and wants to understand better. I don't want to be given talking points and call it a day. I want to have a deep understanding of what I'm saying and be able to explain it without leaning on what is essentially a talking point, right? And the church does not encourage exploration. It encourages following the dogma. So as I've been reading through the Bible this time, as I've already kind of discussed, it's been extremely refreshing to be able to read it exactly how I want to read it, come to any conclusion I want to come to based on what I've just read, and not be leaning on what I've been told is supposed to be what's being said. As I already mentioned, understanding each book's intent is integral to understanding what the author actually wanted to convey when they were writing the book. And not only that, it's integral to understanding the collection as a whole, because understanding an individual book's goal helps us understand why it was canonized. Its goal probably aligned with the person who was doing the canonization's goals. One example are the collection of Paul's letters that we get in the New Testament. All of these letters are meant to address specific problems with churches at the time. They were not written with the idea that they would be applying to churches today. They were specific problems with specific churches that Paul was criticizing. The point I'm trying to make is each of these books that we're reading in the Bible were written as a response to historical pressure. The same reason that you might write a book today, when you're writing it, it will typically be constrained or informed by just the time period you're in. The authors who wrote these books never foresaw them being included in some collection called the Bible. They were not written to be timeless moral guides. They were written in the context of when they were written. These books didn't, to quote Kamala Harris, just fall out of a coconut tree. They were informed by everything before and after them. And for me, trying to understand each author's intent as I've been going through the Bible has given me so much more meaning out of doing my reading, as opposed to just trying to read it as this is what the church says is true and this is what God says is true. It's been an interesting historical analysis into how this completely influential and massive religion that is Christianity came to be and how it changed over time. So, what's next on my reading journey? It's a pretty easy answer because I still have a lot of Bible to go. I've got probably a year's worth of Bible to go. I've been reading one book of the Bible every week since the beginning of this year, and I'm only on Nehemiah. To give you an idea of where that is, it's about this far into the Bible. I have about this much left to go. So, as you can see, I'm basically a third of the way done, maybe a quarter of the way. Um, Point is, I have like, a lot of stuff to go. And again, I want to reemphasize that my whole goal with reading these books is critical engagement and understanding. It's not about tearing down and it's not about conversion. Now, after I'm done reading this, which includes the Old Testament Apocrypha, I wanted to enjoy some of the New Testament Apocrypha as well as understand how it fits into the New Testament narrative, which is why I got this copy of the Apocryphal Gospels, which was translated by Simon Gathercole. And I'm very excited about this book because it includes a lot of very interesting texts that were not included in the canon, but are controversial. Some of them are Gnostic texts, as I hinted at earlier. And then we've got two modern forgeries included in this book as well. So I'm quite excited to read this after I'm done with the Bible as supplemental text to my New Testament journey. After that, I plan on reading the Quran. I've got this translation called the Clear Quran. It's in English. It's written by Dr. Mustafa Khattab. From my research, is the best English translation out there for the Quran. Now, keep in mind that the Quran, according to Muslims and Islam in general, is only ever meant to be read in its original Arabic. However, I don't read Arabic, so I'm going to have to rely on a translation the same way for the Bible. I have to rely on a translation instead of reading the Hebrew and Greek. And last but not least, I'm going to reread the Book of Mormon from the beginning to the end. And I'm probably going to read the Doctrine and Covenants of Pearl of Great Price as well. I think that after I get a better understanding of other religions, I think coming back to this book that kind of started it all for me in my religious journey will be a very, very interesting tale, especially given that we don't know anything about how this book was translated. The only things we know is that Joseph Smith claimed to translate them from gold plates that no longer exist, and we don't know what language it originally was in. And it attempts to mimic the King James language of the original Bible. I just think it's going to be super interesting to understand more of how these religions formed, how they came to be, and where they've ended up, as well as potentially understanding where they're going to go in the future. I think the most important question to answer is, so far in my reading, how have my views of the Bible changed? Firstly, understanding each book individually and trying to treat it as an individual book has been immensely helpful to me. I've also been able to much better put into perspective questions like, why would God tell them to do this? Or why would God tell them to do that? For example, in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, also known as the Torah, there's a lot of instruction from God saying, go in, genocide these people, take their women and children, either kill them as well, or take them as your own, and do it all because you're Israel and you deserve it. When I was a believing person, I would always be very confused on why God would do that. And the answer that I got was typically, oh, that was just the God of the Old Testament. And once Jesus came, everything changed. But now it's much easier to understand these kinds of texts as these people believed that they had a right to this land, and they believed that they had a God that was justifying those beliefs. And that's very, very similar to a lot of things you might see today, whether it be in America or abroad, about using scripture or using what you perceive to be your God to justify what would otherwise be immoral acts. And seeing that present in the Bible makes the Bible feel a lot more real to me and helps me maybe not empathize with these characters, but instead treat them as real people and not just somehow God is trying to convey some deep meaning to me through telling me about these genocides, right? Instead, I'm just seeing it as, oh, these people used what they believe to be their God to justify what they believe to be a justifiable genocide, and they wrote it down for other people to agree with them. And I think that that journey has been very, very helpful for me to get new meaning out of the Bible and to connect with it in a way that most people may not, but in a way that's been super healing for me as someone who previously thought I would just write off scripture for the rest of my life. I still believe that God probably did not have his hand involved, but I find it so interesting as a study into what people believed their God was telling them and what they felt important enough that they would keep in a collection of books that were important to that religion. And that's been so fun for me. I've been enjoying looking on Wikipedia and learning everything there is to know about each of these individual books, understanding the scholarly consensus on whether or not the people involved were historical or not, how the books changed over time, how things were inserted or removed from these books over time, why certain books were not included in canon. All of that is just so fascinating to me as a study of how Christianity developed over time, given that it's one of the most influential religions in history. And I think that if you walk into reading a religious text with a more open mind, I think you might be surprised at what you can get out of reading these books if you give it a fair chance. And I think that if we just go into engaging with these kinds of texts and discussing them in a more respectful way on both sides, we'll get more out of it and we'll see more compromise in general. I want to reemphasize that there's so much complexity to all of these books and these topics. And I am by no means an expert. In fact, I am the opposite. The only thing I have expertise on is what I've read on Wikipedia and what I've gotten from watching Dan McClellan videos on the Bible. But I'm not doing any of this to mock, to dismiss, anything like that. I am just genuinely wanting to engage with these texts and get more out of them than I got when I was a kid. And all that being said, I appreciate your time. I appreciate you listening to me. And let me know if you have any thoughts on what I've said, if you disagree with anything I've said, if there's anything you'd like to add. The comment section is always open. If you're interested in this kind of content, I'm going to continue talking about my journey throughout exploring my life post Mormonism and my spiritual journey. And if that interests you, I would appreciate a subscribe. But I hope you have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.